Hello again, and thank you for joining us for our online class on the book of Romans. Again, this week we are looking at Romans chapter 12. Hope that you've been following along. Paul has been building to this point where he is getting very practical in his advice about what this means to live according to the righteousness of God that is given to us through our faith in Jesus Christ. As he's been emphasizing all along, it is by faith that we are saved. And then as we put our faith in Jesus Christ, the righteous walk by that faith. And he's been laying his theological background to all of this, reminding us that we do nothing to save ourselves. And it doesn't matter if we're Gentile or Jew, we all stand before God as guilty. Now in Jesus, we have been justified and are no longer guilty before him, but are to be slaves. We've been set free from sin and death to be slaves to righteousness. And that's really what chapters 12 through 15 begin to explain to us, is exactly what Paul wants us to understand of what this new life in Jesus is really all about. Now let me bring up my video share here. And let's share my screen. And we move on with our lesson now as we'll get into chapter 12 here. But as he begins to explain this whole life, he says this is something that God is working for us and doing in us. The whole idea of the transformation, the holiness or sanctification that takes place in the life in Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit that he talked about in chapters 6 through 8. Now he comes back to what that looks like on a practical level. And he says it is a transformative type of experience. And we're reminded of the transformation that takes place from first the butterfly, and then it starts out as this ugly caterpillar, but then can be transformed into something so beautiful and alive and full of color. And the word that's used here in this passage about the transforming of our minds comes from the Greek word that we know in English as metamorphosis, the transformation, the changing of something from one thing to something completely another. And that's kind of the background, the picture I want you to keep in your mind as we go through this passage together, as we can think of ourselves in Jesus through the Holy Spirit as spiritual butterflies that have been transformed by God. And he introduces this whole thing in the first two verses, reminding us of what he wants us to do and why he wants us to do it. It is in view of God's mercy. It's not in view of my works, my goodness, my righteousness. It's not in view of what anybody else has done. It is only in view of God's mercy and what he has done that he then calls on us to become these living sacrifices. Offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Living sacrifice, that contradictory phrase, but it goes along with everything Paul's been talking about. It even connects us to the life and ministry, the sacrifice and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which he's told us that back in chapter 6, that when we are baptized into Christ, we are joined with him in his death, burial, and resurrection. And so that becomes the example for us. It is, as he stated toward the end of chapter 8, we want you to be conformed to the image of my Son, Jesus Christ. And so we remember, still, this is something we have to commit ourselves to. That's why we have to give it careful consideration. It is thoughtful. It is something that we give And it's actually the idea behind what he refers to here as, this is an older edition of the NIV. It has the spiritual act of worship. The new NIV has your true and meaningful. The Christian Standard has your true worship. English Standard Version has spiritual worship. The word behind it has with it the concept of it's something it's thoughtful. It's something you give yourself to. It's not a completely intellectual exercise, but it is, we have to give ourselves in a thoughtful, authentic way to this life, which then becomes authentic worship to God. God's been trying to explain to his people for centuries that it wasn't about the sacrifices. It wasn't about the number of calves or lambs or anything else that was offered. It was about their heart. It was about the way they lived their lives. Were they living in love with each other, sharing justice and mercy with everyone around them? And he says, this is your authentic worship. God sees your life as something that is beautiful and wonderful because you have committed yourself to this transformed, this metamorphosis mind, one that has been changed by God through his Holy Spirit because of our faith. But he says, again, it's something we must commit ourselves to, that we want it to be a transformed mind and not one that is conformed to the world around us. And we're going to see this contrast as we go through. Keep that contrast in mind as we look at the next section, how the world approaches things and how the people of God and followers of Jesus are supposed to live in the way they're supposed to think with this transformed mind now in Jesus Christ, which is focused on discerning God's will, not my will, not the government's will, not anybody else's will, God's will. And so that becomes our focus in this new life that is now full color and can find true meaning in this world and in our lives because of the transformation that has taken place, again, by God, not by anything that we have done. So he says, well, let's talk about this even a little more practically as we move along in this, what I'm calling the butterfly life. So be humble. We tend to look at this passage and we immediately jump down to the verses that talk about the body and the gifts of the body and so forth. But notice how he begins. For by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. Then he starts talking about the body. And the only way that that body life can happen as he goes on to describe it is if we all come to it in humility, not thinking more highly of ourselves than we should. Let's keep that first phrase in mind as we think about this. In light of God and his mercy and who he is, there's no place for us to have any kind of spiritual one-upmanship on one another. We're not seeking to be show ourselves to be superior. That just comes from an arrogance and a selfishness that is not part of following Jesus. In fact, back at the end of chapter 3, where he's reminded them that everybody is sinful and it's only by the power of God through his son Jesus that anyone can be saved, he concludes chapter 3 with, so where is your boasting? You have no reason to. You haven't done anything. And we've got to remember that even as we go along through the Christian life, that we need to be humble, putting the needs of others first before our own. That way the body can function in all these different ways, whether it is prophesying, which is simply the word means it's the mouthpiece of God. You're speaking God's words. So any preacher or teacher who is genuinely speaking the words of God, we could say is a prophet from that sense. Let him do it proportion to his faith. If serving, serve. Teaching, encouraging, contributing to the needs of other, leadership, showing mercy, whatever it is, he says, give yourself to it. Because your concern is the needs of others rather than yourself. Which leads into the middle section of chapter 12, which is this beautiful description of the type of love that is at the heart of all of this. And again, it's the agape love, the unselfish love that he is calling us to. That it must be sincere and hate what is evil, clings to what is good, be devoted to one another in brotherly love, honor one another above yourselves, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer, share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn, and live in harmony with everyone. Love deeply. A love that gets out of yourself and gets involved in other people's lives in a feverish way, in a joyful hope so that we can be patient in dealing with other people and the things that they're going through in their life. And we can be patient with ourselves as God continues to work with us. And I've focused on this a little bit in Sunday morning sermon, but verse 15, where he talks about getting to that point where you can rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. And I ask then, ask yourself, which of those is easier for you? And usually we say, oh, well, it's easier to rejoice with someone who's happy and something good has happened. And more difficult to mourn. But think about that for a minute. Once we get involved with other people, you can feel for them. You can mourn for them. I just learned this morning that one of my high school friends, his wife of many years, who's been struggling with cancer for some time, died last night. And my heart mourned for him and broke for him, because I can't truly understand what all he's going through, but I can mourn with him. On the other hand, yes, we can rejoice with people easily when they've overcome cancer, or they've been through something and they've come out the other side and we've been trying to help them, and we can rejoice with them. But it's a little harder when we start talking about, well, I'll rejoice for you when you get recognized for something and I don't, even though I did the same thing. Or it's hard for me to rejoice with you when you get something that I really wanted, like a new car or a new house. Because that selfishness still creeps in. And it really takes us being at that point of true loving humility to rejoice with people when they rejoice, whatever it is, because we're so concerned about them and involved in their life. So live in harmony with everybody. Do what you have to do, which takes him right back to that still includes being humble in this love and in the very life that you live. So don't be proud, last half of verse 16, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Don't be proud. Don't be conceited. Think about who you are as compared to God, and then come to others and be willing to associate with people of low position. Let's think about what God has been doing all this time. Sorry for that. I'll turn the phone off. God has been reaching out to us who are sinners. And yet he has made it possible because of his love to stay with us, to associate with us, to be with us. And he calls on us to do the same thing. Again, to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, who was constantly touching those who were untouchable, eating with those that he shouldn't, those who were considered sinners and unclean. And even in his description of the final judgment in Matthew 25, it comes down to not what doctrinal positions you hold, but it is how have you lived it out, this life of faith in Jesus Christ, and have you given food to the hungry and water to the thirsty, clothes to those in need, visited those who have been falsely accused and thrown in prison. So when you do that, he says, for my people, the least of these, you're doing it for me. But we can't do that if we can't come to it with a humble mind that loves deeply, not only those immediately around us and those who are like us, but those who are not. And I am so proud of the things that we've gotten involved in here at Pine Valley over the past 5.5 years that are truly seeking to get out and associate with people of low, what we might consider low position, or those who are in oppressed situations or who are dealing with great difficulties in life, whether it's our feeding of the homeless at the Good Shepherd Center, reaching out to and ministering to the homeless veterans at the Eugene Ashley House. We have people who work with the Christian Women's Job Corps. We have members who volunteer with A Safe Place, which helps women get out of sex trafficking and get back into a protected and loving kind of life and lead them to something new and productive. And we have the ministry over at Lakeside, which is people who have been chronically homeless, but also have a mental or physical handicap that does not allow them to live in normal situation or circumstances because of their inability to work. And we can go on with a number of things. People who just help each other. And I've seen a lot of that going on here during the pandemic. People just reaching out, I'll bring you some food, I'll do this for you. Just being humble. And he goes on and say, now, and remember, let God be God, and you just be humble, you be loving. As far as it is up to you, you live at peace with everybody. Don't seek vengeance. You let God be the final judge. You let him take care of those things. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And if he is thirsty, give him something to drink. Now this will be heap burning coals on his head. We're quoting there from Proverbs. And we tend to read that and we go, oh, well, somebody's done something bad to me. I can get them back by being kind to them. And that's not what he's talking about. He's talking just be good. Do good things. Overcome, as he says in verse 21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So if your enemy is hungry, you give them food. Doesn't matter how they respond. If they're thirsty, you give them water. Doesn't matter how they respond. God will take care of all that stuff in the end. And what you really do is you do get their attention. They may not be terribly uncomfortable, but you're going to get their attention. So you have responded in a way that's totally different than the world normally responds. So he says, just overcome evil by doing good. And this comes from this humble, deep love, which is part of this transformed life that is found in Jesus Christ, and a transformed mind. It's part of the living sacrifice and how we live on a daily basis. And remember, he says, he's not saying avoid evil. He says overcome it by doing good, by being out there engaged with it. not just staying away, but actually actively being involved in what's going on in the world. This is what he encourages the Christians in Galatia to do in his letter to them, which was one of his earliest letters, that just as they have opportunity, do good to everybody, especially to the household of faith. But do good to everybody as you have opportunity. And that's the very same kind of life that he's describing here. So in this metamorphosis, he reminds us that the sacrificial life equals real, authentic worship. That's what God is looking for. He's not looking for ritual. He's not looking for just going to a place and sitting a certain number of times per week. He's not looking for a certain number of sacrifices. He is looking for what's going on inside of you. And is your mind being transformed by him, where it is constantly seeking to discern God's will and not mine. And it puts others before self through this humility and love, and does good and not evil. And we simply have to look around us in our world, and especially in our country and the society and the things that are going on here. There is so much hate going on. Decisions are being made not out of humility and love and concern for others, but out of selfish desire, wants for my rights, and a desire to be seen as better than someone else or some other group. Agape, the love of God, the love of Jesus Christ demonstrated in his life, will not think more highly of ourselves than we should, and we will not be proud, will not be conceited, and we will associate with anybody at any level to show them the good that comes from the love of God in Jesus Christ as it is fulfilled through his Holy Spirit that's transforming our minds each and every day into the image of Jesus. And that is our goal and our desire and our prayer for every day. So I hope to see most of you or have you all worship with us online this Sunday. We'll be getting into chapter 13, and because again, we're getting into this practical application of everything we just talked about, which is summed up in verse 10, love does no harm to its neighbor, because love is the fulfillment of the law. And so whether it is through the things that we need to do to keep others safe during the pandemic, or whether it is reaching out and truly trying to minister and help others who are in difficult situations, who may be in a lower station in life than we are, simply by circumstance, that we share with them love, because it is the fulfillment of the law. Look forward to seeing everybody this coming Sunday morning and spending that time in worship with you. Between now and then, I encourage you, again, stay safe, continue to pray, keep the faith, give praise to God for the life that we have in Jesus Christ.